in the sun-scorched lands of West Africa, where history echoes through the red soil and the winds still whisper the names of fallen heroes. A young man has risen from the heart of Burkina Faso to defy the legacy of colonizers, dictators, and silent oppressors. His name is Ibrahim Traoré, a soldier, a revolutionary, and to many, the reincarnation of hope itself. Born in 1988 in the small town of Bondakai, Ibrahim was not raised in the marble halls of power, but among the common people, children who played barefoot, families who prayed for peace, and farmers who toiled in fields rich with gold but poor in opportunity. He grew up listening to tales of Thomas Sankara, the legendary leader who once dreamed of a self-reliant Africa before being betrayed by those closest to him. Traoré studied, worked, and fought not for wealth or fame, but because he understood something few dared to admit, that freedom in Africa was still a performance controlled by foreign hands behind velvet curtains. When he joined the military, he was quiet, observant, and deadly serious. He wasn't interested in medals, he was interested in justice. Then came the moment that would shock the world. On September 30th, 2022, while global powers were distracted by the chaos in Europe and collapsing economies in the West, Ibrahim Traoré made his move. At just 34 years old, he led a military coup and seized power in Burkina Faso, not to claim the throne, but to break it and rebuild it in the image of his people. Crowds flooded the streets in celebration, flags waved, songs were sung, and Traoré, clad in military fatigues, stood not as a conqueror, but as a protector. He declared, "We will no longer bow to those who profit from our suffering. This is our land, and we will defend it with our blood if we must." The embassy of France, long a symbol of colonial authority, became a target of fury. Within days, Traoré suspended military deals with foreign forces and began dismantling the very system that had kept his people in chains for decades. But he wasn't done. He turned his eyes to the so-called war on terror, a war that had drenched Burkina Faso in grief for years. Western armies had come, promised peace, and yet the violence only grew. Ibrahim Traoré spoke the unspeakable. If the foreign soldiers are here to protect us, why do we still bury our children? He saw beyond the headlines and military reports. He saw the villages burned, the mothers weeping, the young men disappearing. He realized that this war wasn't always about fighting terror. Sometimes it was about controlling the land beneath their feet, minerals, resources, power, and so he did what no one thought possible. He expelled the foreign troops, trained his own people, and armed local defense forces. He wasn't just building an army, he was building a nation that believed in itself again. And then came the boldest move of all, a direct challenge to the empire that had long kept Burkina Faso in its shadow, France. For decades, France had operated in Burkina Faso, not just through military presence, but through economic control, media manipulation, and political interference. But Ibrahim Traoré, young, fearless, and deeply aware of the ghosts of the past, rejected it all. He terminated French military agreements, ordered their withdrawal, and closed their bases. Western headlines called him reckless, some even called him dangerous. But in the streets of Ouagadougou, he was a lion, a leader, a symbol. Young people wore his image on t-shirts. Grandmothers prayed for his protection. Elders whispered, "We have not seen a man like this since Sankara." And when the world asked him if he was anti-France, his answer was as poetic as it was powerful. "We are not anti-France. We are pro-Burkina Faso. We welcome friends, not masters." That single sentence cut through decades of diplomacy and exposed the raw truth of post-colonial Africa, that sovereignty is not a gift, it is a fight. And for Ibrahim Traoré, the fight had only just begun. As Ibrahim Traoré's name spreads across Africa like wildfire, his mission evolves beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. He is no longer just a military leader or a national figure, he is becoming a symbol of continental resistance, a modern echo of Thomas Sankara's Pan-African dream reborn. Across Mali, Guinea, and Niger, young military leaders are rising with the same flame in their eyes, rejecting colonial ties, tearing up exploitative deals, and vowing to reclaim African sovereignty. These leaders are not waiting for permission from the UN or applause from Western capitals. They are acting boldly, fearlessly, and in unity. Pan-Africanism, long buried under decades of compromise and corruption, is rising again, not in conference halls, but on the front lines of liberation. Yet, as Africa begins to stir, the world begins to panic. Western governments, long used to controlling the narrative, now scramble to frame Traoré as a threat. Is he dangerous because he speaks the truth? Is he a villain because he wants what? Any nation wants control over its own land. Foreign media outlets twist headlines, old allies whisper betrayal, and economic powers plot silently. But Traoré, calm and unshaken, moves with clarity. His focus is not on foreign approval, it is on the suffering people of Burkina Faso who have waited for decades to breathe the air of dignity. He doesn't blink when French forces are asked to leave. He doesn't flinch when aid is suspended. He simply says, "We will eat less if we must, but we will eat what is ours." And so begins the next war, not of guns and bullets, but of resources. Burkina Faso is rich in gold, manganese, uranium, and oil riches that have long lined the pockets of foreign companies while the people sleep hungry. Traoré has had enough. He cancels exploitative contracts, reclaims national mines, and demands that Africa stop exporting wealth and importing poverty. Western investors flee, but the people rejoice. And while the world watches his economic rebellion, Traoré turns inward to the battlefield of minds. He sees that true revolution is not only in soldiers, it is in students, in schools, in ideas. He reforms education to teach African history, African heroes, African truth. He believes that a colonized mind is more dangerous than an occupying army. In classrooms across Burkina Faso, children now learn of Sankara Lumumba and the empires that existed long before Europe arrived. Yet revolution always comes with a price. Threats surround him, whispers of assassination, foreign spies, betrayal. From within, Traoré is no fool. He purges traitors, rotates his sleeping quarters, trusts few. But he remains unafraid. "They may kill me," he says, "but they will not kill the idea." The spirit of revolution, once unleashed, cannot be bottled again. And now, as the dust rises behind him and history unfolds before him, Ibrahim Traoré stands not just as a man but as a movement. A new Africa is waking, a continent that no longer asks to be saved but demands to be respected. From the deserts of the Sahel to the forests of the Congo, young Africans whisper his name like a spark passed hand to hand. Traoré, the lion who roared, the rebel who stood tall, the storm that could not be stopped. As Ibrahim Traoré's revolution matured, it began to plant seeds not just in Burkina Faso, but across Africa, and the world started to take note. No longer was this young soldier just a headline or curiosity. He had become a global symbol of defiance, dignity, and a new political consciousness rising from the ashes of post-colonial fatigue. Traoré wasn't seeking to build an empire, he was trying to restore a people's soul. In his speeches, he often reminded the youth that our enemies are not invincible, but our silence is. These words struck deep. In African universities, his quotes were scrawled on blackboards. In urban cafes, his image was printed on t-shirts next to Sankara and Lumumba. In the villages, griots sang songs of the captain who woke the lion. Chapter after chapter of this unfolding story began to feel like a prophecy, returning the prophecy of a liberated, united Africa. But revolution does not feed on inspiration alone. It must wrestle with the hard, bitter soil of reality. As began, Traoré's government faced the grinding burden of governance. Inflation surged as foreign aid was slashed. Infrastructure lagged. Terrorist groups, funded from the shadows, tried to destabilize the country's fragile peace. But Traoré didn't flinch. He turned to local solutions. Village militias trained in defense, community-led rebuilding of roads and schools, and direct involvement of youth brigades in agriculture projects. We will grow our own food, defend our own borders, teach our own children, he said, and it wasn't just a speech, it was a roadmap. The West launched a media counteroffensive. Accusations flew: dictator, populist, Putin's puppet. International think tanks warned of destabilization. But in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, the people saw something else. Schools reopening, health clinics returning, young people feeling pride instead of shame. If building my country without asking permission makes me dangerous, then so be it, Traoré told a foreign reporter, eyes fixed, unwavering, saw a shift in the geopolitical axis. Burkina Faso entered strategic talks with other anti-imperialist states, not out of desperation, but to build alternatives. Discussions with Brazil for agro-technology, agreements with Russia for energy support, and a military exchange with Cuba for defensive training all shocked the old powers. But for Traoré, it was not rebellion for its own sake. It was sovereignty in action, and he made sure that Burkina Faso did not fall into the trap of replacing one master with another. We will not trade white chains for new colored ones, he warned. By whispers of a new federation began to emerge. Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso hinted at forming a unified economic and defense bloc. For decades, the idea of African unity had been poetic, symbolic. Traoré was turning it into policy. Youth from the three nations began joint training. Border controls were reduced. Even the dream of a new shared currency not controlled by France was seriously debated. It was a rebirth of hope that Kwame Nkrumah once dared to dream. Traoré turned his attention to culture and media. He funded local filmmakers to tell African stories. He banned French propaganda channels and launched state-run programs focused on indigenous languages and traditions. Art was no longer entertainment, it was resistance. Culture is the armor of a nation, he declared. His goal was simple: decolonize the mind. Artists, musicians, poets, and thinkers now had space to breathe, speak, and lead. A renaissance began not from ivory towers, but from the soil of struggle, brought internal challenge. Not everyone supported his radical shift. Former elites, cut off from foreign perks and power, began to mobilize. Civil protests emerged, backed by NGOs tied to foreign funding. Traoré didn't use tanks, he used town halls. He met with youth leaders, village elders, religious figures. He listened, debated, and sometimes admitted mistakes. This rare humility disarmed many critics. Even his opponents were forced to admit he is not corrupt, he is not afraid, and he listens. In tragedy struck, An ambush killed dozens of soldiers, brave young men defending the north. The country mourned, but Traoré stood before them not as a distant president, but as a grieving comrade. Their blood will not be forgotten. Their sacrifice will build this nation, he promised. Recruitment soared. Volunteers signed up in record numbers, not for money but for meaning. Chapter 18 ushered in global attention. Traoré was invited to speak at African summits. He declined. "I do not need stages. I need results." His rejection of empty protocol earned him both enemies and respect. But more African youth now watched Burkina Faso, not Paris, for leadership. A continent long told it was too poor, too broken, too divided, had found in Traoré a mirror. One that showed a future still possible. By chapter 19, the transformation was clear. Burkina Faso was not perfect, but it was proud. Small factories were built, cooperatives flourished, schools opened where once there was dust. The economy was modest but rooted. The military was still fighting, but morale had never been higher. And through it all, Traoré remained grounded. He walked without an entourage. He ate local food. He refused luxury. He once said, "A leader should never live better than the people, or he forgets who he serves." And so, in chapter 20, a question rises. What happens if this revolution survives? What if Ibrahim Traoré is not a temporary hero, but the beginning of a continental awakening? The world is watching, waiting. Some pray he fails. Others dare to hope. One thing is clear. The fire has been lit. The lion has roared. And across Africa, young hearts are waking from slumber, whispering his name.